Have you ever sat next to someone who thought the entire world revolved around them? You know the type, the kind of person who stomps through life like it owes them something, throwing attitude at everyone around, acting like common decency is beneath them. Now, imagine being stuck next to that person on a 6-hour flight. What would you do? Would you stay quiet and endure it, or would you push back? And what if, just what if, that rude, arrogant passenger was about to find out that the person they were looking down on was actually someone they never should have messed with? Stay with me, because what happened on this flight will not only leave you speechless, but it might just change the way you look at people forever. Hey there, I'm glad you're here. I don't know what brought you to this video. Maybe it popped up on your recommended, maybe the title got you curious, or maybe you've seen a situation like this unfold in real life and you're just waiting for that moment of sweet justice. Whatever it was, let me tell you this, you're exactly where you need to be. Because the story I'm about to share with you, it's not just another viral airplane drama. It's not just about a rude passenger getting served some much-needed instant karma. No, this story runs deeper. It's a story about assumptions, hidden identities, and one unforgettable twist that left an entire flight stunned. And trust me, by the time we get to the ending, you'll understand why this flight became one of the most talked about moments in the air. Now, I want you to do something for me. For the next few minutes, forget whatever else you were scrolling through. Put your phone down if you're multitasking, turn up the volume if you're driving, or just sit back and listen closely because what you're about to hear is more than entertainment. It's a lesson in humility, and it all started with a woman named Grace and a man who thought the world owed him a first-class seat, even when he was sitting in economy. Picture this, a packed flight out of Los Angeles, headed to New York. It was one of those busy Monday mornings when every seat is booked, the gate is chaotic, and people are more interested in finding overhead bin space than making eye contact. You've got business travelers, parents juggling toddlers, college students flying back to school, and then there was Grace. She boarded late, not because she was running behind, but because she had taken a moment to help an elderly woman who was struggling with her luggage outside the terminal. That's just the kind of person Grace was. Kind, patient, unassuming. She didn't dress flashy, didn't carry designer bags. Just a soft smile, a calm voice, and a quiet presence. She looked like someone's favorite aunt or your sweet next-door neighbor. You wouldn't guess anything extraordinary about her at first glance. But remember that. It's important. When Grace finally made her way down the aisle to her assigned seat, 27B, right in the middle, there was already someone sitting there. A man, late 30s maybe, in a tailored blazer, designer sunglasses still on his face, AirPods in, clearly annoyed that the flight hadn't taken off yet. His carry-on bag was taking up half her seat. His legs were sprawled. And the moment Grace stopped beside him and politely said, "Excuse me, I think you're in my seat," the atmosphere shifted. He didn't even look up at her. Just gave a scoff, shook his head like she was interrupting something far more important and muttered, "Yeah, I don't think so. This is my spot." Let me ask you something. Have you ever had someone dismiss you so quickly with so little regard that it actually stunned you into silence? That's what happened to Grace. And for a moment, she just stood there, confused, double-checking her boarding pass, wondering if she'd made a mistake. But no, there it was. 27B, middle seat. Her seat. She pointed it out kindly, but the man still wouldn't budge. Now here's where things started to escalate. The man, who we'll just call Mr. Big Shot for now, began to speak louder, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "Look, lady," he said, "I paid for extra legroom. I'm not getting crammed between two strangers for 6 hours. Take the window, or find a flight attendant, I don't care." And just like that, the judgment began. Some people rolled their eyes. Some pulled out their phones, half expecting this to turn into one of those airplane meltdown videos. But Grace?
She didn't yell.
She didn't curse. She didn't even raise her voice. She just did something that completely threw him off. She smiled. Now, I need you to hold on to that moment, that smile. Because what Grace did next and who she turned out to be is going to make you rethink everything you thought about how this story was going to go. But before we get there, let me ask you something else. Why do we assume things about people based on their appearance? Why is it that someone dressed in designer labels automatically gets respect, while someone in simple clothes gets overlooked? Why do we size people up before even knowing their names? This video isn't just about one rude man and one calm woman. It's about all of us. How we treat others when no one's watching. How we react when we think someone can't offer us anything. But sometimes, life has a funny way of putting us exactly where we need to be to learn a lesson we've been avoiding. And for Mr. Big Shot, that lesson was coming at 35,000 feet, and he had no idea who he was sitting next to. So, here's the deal. If you've ever wanted to see arrogance meet humility, if you've ever waited for that perfect moment when someone finally gets called out in the most unexpected way, then don't go anywhere. Because this story is just getting started. In the next few minutes, you're going to see what happens when a person's true identity is revealed in front of a full cabin of passengers, and the reaction? Well, let's just say there wasn't a single person who didn't turn their head in disbelief. And here's my promise to you. By the end of this video, you will find out exactly who Grace is, and why sitting next to her turned out to be the biggest surprise of this man's entire year. But for now, let's rewind a little. Let's take a closer look at the man who refused to move. Let's see what made him so entitled, so sure that he was more important than everyone else on that plane. And let's find out what happens when he realizes that his behavior is about to be exposed to the very person who has the power to change everything for him. What Mr. Big Shot didn't know was that Grace had a secret. One that would not only shake him, but change his life. And the moment that secret came out, well, let's just say the whole plane turned silent. But to know what that secret was and how it unraveled, you're going to have to stick with me. Because this is where the real story begins. Now, before we get to that jaw-dropping reveal, we need to rewind a bit. Step back from that narrow airplane aisle and zoom into Grace's world. Because the truth is, what happened on that flight didn't start at Gate 17 in LAX. It started long before, months, even years before, when Grace made a decision that would set off a chain of events leading right to seat 27B. You see, Grace wasn't just flying to New York on a whim. She wasn't heading to a family reunion or a business trip or some casual vacation. No, this flight had weight. There was something at the end of that runway she hadn't faced in a long time. And the way she carried herself, that calm, collected energy, the soft smile, the patient tone, it wasn't the kind of peace that comes from comfort. It was the kind that's forged after walking through fire. Grace used to live in New York years ago. Back then, she was a rising star in the corporate world, sharp, strategic, respected. Not the kind of woman anyone would dare to dismiss. She worked behind the scenes, rarely seeking the spotlight, but when she spoke in boardrooms, people listened. The thing was, most people didn't really know Grace. They knew her title, her accomplishments, her poise, but few knew her past, and even fewer knew why she disappeared so suddenly from the business scene just 2 years ago. One day, she was on the cover of an industry magazine as one of the top women in tech, and the next?
Gone.
No press release. No public farewell. Just silence. What most people didn't realize is that Grace had been forced to choose between her reputation and her conscience. There was a scandal. A quiet one that never reached the tabloids, never trended on social media. But it rocked her world nonetheless. She discovered something behind closed doors, fraud, corruption, things that could have taken down people in very high places.
People she once trusted.
Instead of staying quiet and playing along like they expected her to, she blew the whistle. And then,
she vanished.
Burned by the very industry she helped build. A few tried to drag her name through the mud. Others pretended she never existed. And Grace, unwilling to fight fire with fire, stepped away from everything. No lawsuits. No interviews.
She just walked away.
That's how she ended up on the West Coast, living in quiet obscurity, volunteering at community shelters, helping kids with scholarships, mentoring young women without needing a LinkedIn profile to prove her worth. And for the most part, she was okay with that. She didn't need the applause. But there was one thing left unresolved. One piece of the puzzle that kept her up at night. The man who had orchestrated it all. The one who smiled in her face, shook her hand, and signed off on decisions that left honest people broken. That man?
He was in New York now.
And he'd recently accepted a public role in a new organization that claimed to champion ethical innovation, an ironic twist that didn't sit right with Grace. So when she received a discreet invitation to speak at a leadership summit in Manhattan, an event that would be attended by movers, shakers, and maybe even him, she said yes. Not for revenge, not even for justice, really. She just needed to know, did he ever regret it? Did he remember what he did? Or had he rewritten the story in his own mind like so many do? And that's why Grace was on that plane. That's why she was quiet, thoughtful, and perhaps more tolerant than most people would be toward a rude stranger in her seat. Because this flight wasn't about ego for her, it was a step toward something bigger. Something she wasn't even sure she was ready to face. But let's go back to the cabin now, because things were starting to stir. A flight attendant had approached, politely trying to mediate the situation. Mr. Big Shot, still acting like he owned the plane, rolled his eyes and insisted he wasn't moving. "I'm 6'3", he argued. "I'm not squeezing into that window seat like a sardine." His tone was sharp, dismissive. His arrogance wasn't just about the seat. It was about the assumption that no one around him could possibly outrank him in importance. And yet, several passengers had begun to whisper. A few recognized Grace, though they couldn't quite place her. One woman nudged her husband and said, "She looks familiar, didn't she speak at that conference last year?" But Grace just kept her composure, quietly defusing the situation. "It's okay," she told the attendant. "I'll take the aisle." Now this is where it gets interesting, because Grace had every right to push the issue. And legally, the flight crew could have insisted the man move. But she didn't make it a scene. That in itself unsettled him. He expected a fight. He expected a power struggle. But instead, he was left wondering, who was this woman? And here's where the layers start stacking up. Because as the plane finally took off, Grace began reading through a folder in her bag. Handwritten notes, industry reports, old photographs, and a sealed envelope with a crest no one on that plane would recognize unless they were deep into corporate circles. Meanwhile, the man beside her, let's call him Alex now, since we'll be seeing more of him, started glancing at her papers, trying to read over her shoulder. That was his nature. Always looking for leverage, always trying to figure out who someone really was, just in case he needed to use it later. But here's the part that nobody knew, not even Grace. Someone else on that plane was watching her, too. A woman in business class, traveling under a different name, with a hidden earpiece and an encrypted phone. She hadn't come for the summit. She'd come for Grace. Because while Grace had disappeared quietly, there were people who never stopped watching. People who knew what she uncovered back then and had been waiting for the right moment to bring her back in. This woman, let's just say her interest wasn't purely professional. She had her own past with the same man Grace was flying to confront. And now, all three of them were on the same flight, hurtling across the sky toward a city none of them had truly left behind. But let's not jump ahead just yet. Because right now, Alex was starting to feel the heat. Something about Grace unnerved him. He tried to assert dominance from the start, taking her seat, brushing her off, turning up the volume on his AirPods to shut out her voice. But now, he was doing double takes at the documents she was reviewing. He saw a name he recognized. A logo that made his stomach twist. A note that read, in neat cursive, "They think no one remembers. But some debts never disappear." He pretended not to notice. Adjusted his watch. Looked away. But the tension was building. And just when he thought things couldn't get more uncomfortable, the captain came on the intercom with a routine announcement and then paused. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to recognize a very special guest on board today. Someone whose contributions to ethical innovation have recently made national headlines." Alex froze. Grace didn't even look up. "We'll be flying with one of the keynote speakers for the Manhattan Future Leaders Summit, known for her courageous stance against corporate corruption." Several heads turned. Alex started to shift in his seat, his jaw tightening. "Please join us in welcoming Grace Dalton on board." A ripple of applause broke out. Alex's face drained of color. And Grace? She just smiled again. But don't think this is where the story ends, not even close. Because the real reason Grace was on that plane had yet to unfold. The envelope in her bag held something far more powerful than recognition. And the woman watching her from the front of the plane? She wasn't the only one who had questions. Before this flight landed, someone would be forced to tell the truth. And someone else might not walk away so clean. But who was watching whom? And who, exactly, was about to be exposed? Keep watching. Because the next move, it's the one nobody saw coming. As the applause slowly faded and the passengers settled back into their seats, a thick, invisible tension remained suspended in the cabin like a storm cloud no one dared to acknowledge. Alex kept his gaze fixed on the seat back in front of him, his mind racing with a cocktail of anxiety and disbelief. Grace Dalton. That Grace Dalton. The woman whose name he hadn't heard spoken out loud in nearly 2 years. Not since the night everything spiraled out of control behind closed doors, and everyone involved swore never to speak of it again. He had assumed she'd faded away quietly, her influence neutralized, her fire burned out. Yet here she was, sitting just inches away, with the calm composure of someone who knew exactly where she was going and who she might confront when she got there. But what unsettled him most wasn't her presence. It was that smile. That knowing, disarming smile. It wasn't anger. It wasn't smugness. It was something far more dangerous. Certainty. Meanwhile, in the upscale quiet of business class, the woman who had been monitoring Grace from afar, her name, at least the one on her ticket, was Mallory Reed, leaned back in her seat and reread the anonymous message she'd received an hour before boarding. It hadn't come from a standard text, but through a secure app she only used for off-the-record intel, the kind that didn't trace back to any one organization. The message was simple, direct, and unsettling. She's on the flight. You're not the only one watching. If you want the truth, follow the paper trail she carries. Don't let her land before you know what's inside that envelope. At first, Mallory assumed it was a bluff, someone playing games. But now, after the captain's announcement, it was clear. Grace wasn't just traveling. She was returning to the spotlight, possibly with information capable of unraveling everything that had been carefully buried. But here's where the plot thickens. Just as the plane reached cruising altitude and the flight attendants began moving through the aisles, another seemingly disconnected figure entered the story. Back in New York, in a sleek corner office overlooking Manhattan, a man named Elias Tran stood by his floor-to-ceiling window, holding his phone with trembling fingers. Elias wasn't on the plane, but he had just received something that made his heart drop into his stomach, a photograph. Not a new one, not a tabloid photo or a media leak, but an old image. A scanned photo from years ago, taken during a private meeting in a penthouse boardroom where only a handful of executives were present. Elias recognized it instantly. In the background, barely visible, was Grace, seated, expression unreadable, but unmistakable. Scrawled across the bottom in red ink were just 5 words. Did you think we forgot? Elias hadn't spoken to Grace since the fallout, and he'd always assumed she'd gone underground willingly. But now, someone was trying to dig up the past. The timing wasn't random. That leadership summit Grace was flying into? Elias was also scheduled to appear. A keynote panelist. A face of progress. The irony was suffocating. If she had proof, actual documents or recordings from that night, everything could crumble. But more than that, if someone else had the same information and was using both of them like chess pieces in a bigger game, then neither Elias nor Alex was safe. Back on the plane, Grace had noticed the man next to her had gone unusually quiet. His posture had changed, no longer arrogant, but stiff, defensive. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She could sense the unraveling starting from within. What she didn't see, however, was the flicker of recognition that passed through his eyes as he glanced at the corner of her folder. It wasn't just the documents that had rattled him, it was the photograph peeking from the edge. A photograph he had never seen in public before, one that had only existed in a private archive locked in a now dismantled server. If she had that, then someone had breached the vault. Which begged the question, who gave it to her? And here's where the paranoia started to creep in. Because Grace hadn't found that photo herself. It had arrived anonymously weeks ago, left in her mailbox without a return address, accompanied by a note that simply said, "The truth still matters. Finish what you started." At the time, she didn't know if it was a trap or a genuine call to action. But the picture led her to revisit the files, the timelines, and eventually to accept the invitation to the summit. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. She hadn't spoken to any journalists or former colleagues. And yet, someone else, possibly even multiple people, were already circling around this story like sharks sensing blood. That's when something strange happened. Mallory, still watching from her seat, noticed a man in coach stand up and walk down the aisle toward the bathroom, but then pause slightly as he passed Grace's row. His movement wasn't unusual, but the way he lingered, just for a second too long, set off a quiet alarm in her head. He wore the standard travel uniform, hoodie, backpack, baseball cap, pulled low. But when he turned, just before disappearing behind the curtain, she caught a glimpse of something under his sleeve, a black ink tattoo that matched a symbol she'd seen before. Not in any official file, but on a private case she'd once consulted for a government agency. A mark used by a discreet group of fixers, people hired not to ask questions, but to ensure silence. If someone like that was on the plane, the stakes weren't just reputational anymore. They were potentially fatal. And still, Grace remained unaware. Grace, who had stepped away from power, who had chosen peace over revenge, who was now being watched by strangers, hunted by old enemies, and possibly manipulated by someone she had never met. Even her allies were starting to question the truth. Was Grace simply trying to expose the past, or was she part of something larger, something more calculated? Because the timing, the access, the eerie precision with which she had reemerged, it all suggested a deeper plan. But was it hers? Alex, now visibly sweating, pretended to reach for the call button but hesitated. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, not now. He needed to send a message, warn someone, do something, but any movement might tip his hand. What if Grace knew more than he thought? What if she was recording him right now? What if this whole encounter had been staged? And just as he was spiraling in his thoughts, the curtain separating coach and business class opened again. Mallory stepped through, walking casually down the aisle as if heading to the bathroom. But she paused near Grace's row, glanced down with a slight nod, and whispered a single sentence under her breath. "You're not alone." Grace looked up sharply. For a flicker of a second, her mask broke. Then, just as quickly, it returned. Mallory kept walking. The message had been delivered, but the meaning? That was still shrouded in layers. Was it a warning? An assurance? A threat cloaked as an ally's whisper? Whatever it was, Grace understood now that this flight wasn't just a transition between cities. It was a trap, or a test, or maybe both. She tightened her grip on the envelope in her lap, because inside it was the one thing none of them could afford to see revealed. And once the plane touched down, there would be no turning back. So, who was pulling the strings? And more importantly, who was about to cut them?
Stay tuned.
Because the answers? They're just one landing away. The plane had begun its descent, and the skyline of New York peeked through the clouds like a secret just waiting to be told. The city shimmered in the morning light, all steel and glass and second chances, but inside that cabin, the air had grown thick with unease. Grace sat upright now, no longer browsing the contents of her folder. Her hands were still, resting on her knees, but her mind was racing. She was replaying Mallory's words in her head. "You're not alone." At first, she took it as a signal of support, a quiet confirmation that someone else was on her side. But the more she thought about it, the more those words twisted in her gut. Not alone could mean backup, or it could mean surveillance. It could mean someone was working with her or watching her. And that difference could cost her everything. The flight attendants made the usual announcements. The seatbelt lights flashed, but none of it registered. Not for Grace, not for Alex, not for Mallory. The plane felt like a sealed chamber now, a slow-moving capsule headed straight into a storm of buried secrets and dangerous truths. But then something happened, something subtle. As Grace leaned down to tuck her folder back into her carry-on, a loose page slid out from the envelope she thought was sealed tight. She quickly snatched it up before Alex could see, but her heart skipped when she caught sight of the handwriting. It wasn't hers. And it wasn't the same anonymous script that had been on the photo weeks ago. This was different. The page wasn't a document or a transcript. It was a letter. One that began with her name in a familiar scrawl. The kind of penmanship that stops your breath when it belongs to someone you thought was long gone. Grace, if you're reading this, then you've already decided to walk back into the fire. I know you think you understand what happened 2 years ago, but there's more. Much more. Her eyes scanned the rest, her throat tightening. The letter wasn't from a stranger, or a whistleblower, or even a journalist. It was from her sister. Her sister, Lena, who had supposedly died in a car crash just 6 months before Grace left the company. A tragic accident on a rainy highway, officially ruled as driver error. Grace had mourned her, had spiraled privately through the kind of grief no one saw. And then, months later, the evidence Grace had uncovered led her to walk away from her entire career. She thought the corruption ended with embezzlement, sabotage, and fraud. She thought the betrayal stopped at spreadsheets and falsified reports. But if Lena had written this letter, if she had known something was coming, then her death might not have been an accident. It might have been a warning. And that's when everything shattered. Because buried inside the letter, between phrases of sorrow and fear, was a line that flipped the entire narrative on its head. Mallory wasn't the one who betrayed you. She was trying to protect me. The real enemy was always watching from your side. Grace's eyes widened, pulse pounding in her ears. Mallory? The same woman who had whispered that cryptic reassurance just minutes ago? She had been there all along? And if she wasn't the threat, then who was? She turned her head slowly, as if searching for something her instincts already knew. Alex. Only now he was no longer seated beside her. At some point during the descent, while everyone else was preoccupied with gathering their belongings and preparing to land, he had quietly slipped away toward the front of the cabin. Not to use the restroom. Not to stretch. He had walked straight toward the cockpit door. And Grace hadn't noticed until now. But it wasn't just his disappearance that chilled her. It was the line Lena had written at the very end of the letter, hastily scrawled in the margin like a final gasp of truth. His real name isn't Alex. He used to go by Gabriel. And he knows everything about you. More than you ever told him. The world seemed to tilt. Grace's vision tunneled for a moment, heart thudding so hard it made her fingertips shake. Gabriel. That name was like an open wound. Years ago, back when Grace had been building her reputation, there had been one person who stood by her through the worst of it. A partner. A confidant. She had trusted him with her fears, her hopes, her plans. And then one day he vanished. No goodbye. No explanation.
Just gone.
Everyone said he'd left the country after a deal went bad, that he'd betrayed a few too many people. Grace never believed it. She thought maybe he'd been silenced, maybe even killed. She never imagined he'd been watching her the whole time. But now it all made sense. The fake name. The overcompensation. The strange way he seemed to flinch at certain documents in her folder. Gabriel hadn't just been keeping an eye on her. He had inserted himself right back into her orbit, under the perfect disguise, hoping she wouldn't notice. And the worst part? He had taken her seat, forced his way into proximity, not to antagonize her, but to ensure she didn't see something or someone before he did. Mallory. Grace stood up, against the flow of passengers preparing to disembark, and began moving up the aisle, her mind spinning through every conversation, every memory, every moment where something felt off. The turbulence, the timing, the message she'd received in LA. It had all been orchestrated, not by her enemies, but by someone who once claimed to love her.
And now?
She didn't know what Gabriel wanted. Revenge? Redemption? Or something far worse. She reached the front of the plane just as the door opened and the jet bridge connected. Security personnel stood outside, scanning faces, quietly nodding to passengers. Mallory was already there, speaking with a man in a dark suit who passed her something small, perhaps a badge, or a keycard, or something even more critical. She caught Grace's eye for the briefest moment, then turned away, slipping into the crowd and disappearing into the terminal. Grace wanted to follow. She wanted answers. But then she felt something cold slide into her coat pocket. A folded card. She reached in, opened it, and read the words that nearly stopped her heart. You're not alone, but you're not safe either. He's already one step ahead. Room 214, Park Lenox Hotel, midnight. And scrawled underneath, in handwriting she didn't recognize. Don't trust anyone who knew you before. Everything she thought she knew shattered. The mission? Twisted. The villain? Unmasked. The truth? Still waiting. And now so was the next move. The question is, when Grace finally makes it to that room, will she be walking into safety or a trap? Keep watching. Because what happens next changes everything. The Park Lenox Hotel towered above the Manhattan skyline like a monument to secrets, the kind of place where stories unraveled quietly behind mirrored glass, where powerful people disappeared into rooms without leaving a trace, and where silence had a price. Grace stepped into the lobby with her heart lodged somewhere between her throat and stomach, every instinct screaming that this was more than just a meeting place. It was a turning point. The card in her pocket felt heavier with every step she took, its cryptic message now etched into her memory like a brand. Don't trust anyone who knew you before. That line didn't just whisper doubt, it screamed betrayal. And yet, it also told her what she already feared. The real danger wasn't in what she was chasing, but in who might be chasing her. The elevator ride to the 22nd floor felt like a slow ascent into something irreversible. Each floor that blinked past on the panel was a countdown, not to safety or salvation, but to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. When she stepped out into the quiet hallway, the carpet muffled her footsteps, but her mind was a riot of noise. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, and for a moment, she almost ignored it, but then saw the name flash across the screen and froze. Lena. Not a number. Not an email. A live call. She answered with a trembling hand. Lena? The voice on the other end wasn't panicked, but calm in a way that made her skin crawl. You're not supposed to be there yet, Lena said softly, as if watching her from a distance. You're moving too fast, Grace. You don't understand how deep this goes. Grace's mouth went dry. Are you here? In the hotel? But Lena ignored the question. You still think this is about the documents?
About what they did.
It's not. It's about what they're going to do next. The call cut off. No click, no goodbye, just dead air, like a signal had been swallowed by something darker than silence. Grace stood frozen for a moment, clutching the phone to her chest, when a new sound pulled her back. Footsteps behind her.
Slow.
Measured. She turned. Gabriel, Alex, or whatever he was calling himself now, stood at the end of the hall, hands raised in a gesture that looked non-threatening but felt anything but. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they held too much history. We need to talk, he said, walking toward her. Not as enemies. As the only two people left who know what really happened. She didn't move. Tell me who you're working for. He shook his head. It's not that simple. No, she said, her voice brittle. You made it that simple the second you lied to my face for an entire flight. His tone dropped, the performative calm slipping. I lied because I had to. If you'd known who I was, you never would have let me close enough to keep you alive. And right now, Grace, that's all I'm trying to do. She wanted to believe him, but her heart wouldn't let her. Not when Lena's voice still echoed in her mind. Don't trust anyone who knew you before. Gabriel stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. Room 214 isn't just a meeting spot. It's a trap. You walk through that door and you won't walk back out. They've been 2 steps ahead the whole time. You think you're exposing something, but all you're doing is feeding them the evidence they need to wipe every trace of it clean. Her blood ran cold. Who are they? He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a folded photo from his jacket. Look. She snatched it from him and unfolded the image. It was surveillance, grainy, black and white, but clear enough to recognize the faces. Her sister, Mallory, and Elias Tran shaking hands, smiling. The timestamp on the photo was dated 3 days ago. 3 days ago, Lena had been declared dead, and Elias had sworn on camera that he hadn't spoken to either of them in years. Her stomach turned. This isn't possible. I've been following them, Gabriel said. Lena faked her death, Grace. Or someone helped her do it. Either way, you've been walking into a trap from the start. And the worst part is you have to choose who to believe. Her mind reeled. It couldn't be true. But how could it not be? Was Lena alive but compromised? Was she part of something bigger, something darker, manipulating Grace to expose the evidence so they could erase it forever? And Mallory, was she truly an ally, or was her carefully timed warning just another layer of misdirection? The elevator behind them chimed. Someone was coming up. Gabriel stepped back. You have 10 seconds to decide. Come with me, and I'll take you to someone who can prove Lena's alive and what Elias is planning. But if you walk into that room, you're walking into the lion's mouth, and you won't get another shot. Grace looked at the keycard in her hand. 214. The weight of it pulsed like a heartbeat in her palm. Every instinct screamed that there was no right choice. Stay with Gabriel, and risk walking back into the arms of the man who disappeared from her life without a trace, only to return under a false name and half-truths. Go to room 214 and possibly step into a carefully crafted trap laid by the people she once loved, or thought she loved. Either way, the person she trusted most was no longer her sister, or her ex-partner, or even herself. The only certainty was uncertainty. The hallway light flickered. The door to 214 was now just a few feet away. The elevator behind her opened. She was out of time. She had to choose. And whatever door she opened, there was no coming back from it. The next moment would change everything. The door to room 214 stood in front of Grace like a test of everything she thought she understood. Her fingers hovered over the keycard, heart slamming against her ribs, while behind her, Gabriel's footsteps grew more distant, until she no longer heard them at all. He had left, or maybe disappeared again. And for a moment, she was tempted to turn back and follow. But something deeper, more instinctual, pulled her toward the door. If this was a trap, it was one she needed to walk into with her eyes open. Because she was done playing catch-up. She had to see who was inside. She had to know the truth, no matter what it cost her. The keycard slid through the lock, and the green light blinked. She pushed the door open. The room was dark, heavy curtains drawn, but the dim glow of a single table lamp cast long shadows across the floor. There was someone sitting at the desk, back to her, head bowed like they were waiting, not for her arrival, but for her reaction. When the figure turned around, the breath caught in her throat. It was Elias Tran. But not the version of him that appeared on magazine covers or in conference hall speeches. This Elias was thinner, grayer, eyes bloodshot, and jaw clenched like a man whose lies had finally become too big to carry. He didn't look surprised to see her. In fact, he looked regretful. You weren't supposed to come here, he said quietly. You were supposed to be gone. Off the radar. You walked away for a reason. Grace took a step forward, adrenaline still hot in her veins. So did you. But you never stopped watching, did you? You were always 10 moves ahead. What is this? Damage control? Elias sighed, motioning to the chair across from him. This is the end of the illusion, Grace. Sit down. She didn't move. I said sit. There was no threat in his voice, but there didn't need to be. The weight of everything crashing down around her was threat enough. She sat. What do you want? She asked. Answers? Forgiveness? Or just someone to blame when this whole thing falls apart? Elias leaned back in the chair and opened a laptop on the desk, tilting it toward her. The screen flickered to life, displaying what looked like a live feed, dozens of camera angles, all tracking different people across airports, hotel lobbies, corporate offices. Some faces she didn't recognize. But some she did. Mallory.
Gabriel.
Even Lena. And then herself. The footage was from inside the plane. From the elevator. From the hotel lobby. Grace blinked, her breath catching as the weight of it sank in. You've been tracking me, she whispered. Elias shook his head slowly. Not just you. All of you. Everyone who was part of the project. You think this was about embezzlement and misused data? That was a smokescreen. The real work, what we built, it wasn't just experimental tech. It was predictive surveillance. We could anticipate behavioral patterns, manipulate public reaction, steer global decisions without anyone realizing they were being guided. Her mouth went dry. That's illegal. He gave a humorless laugh. You think that stopped anyone? You think laws mean anything when national security and billion-dollar contracts are on the line? Grace stared at the screen, her own face staring back at her in grayscale. So you've been watching everyone this whole time, even after I left. He nodded. Especially after you left. You were the wild card. The only one who knew enough to undo it all. She felt sick. Lena knew. Yes, Elias said, and for the first time, his voice cracked. And she turned against us. That's why she had to disappear. But then she started leaking information, creating a trail. She was trying to bring you back into the fold. I thought she wanted to stop us. But it turns out, she had a different plan. Grace leaned forward. What kind of plan? Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he typed something into the laptop and another screen opened. An email thread between Lena and a list of anonymous recipients. The contents were redacted, encrypted, but the subject lines alone were enough to send a chill down Grace's spine. They're watching. Release failsafe? Grace is the trigger. She stared at him. I'm the what? He met her gaze. You were always the backup plan, Grace. Lena knew we'd never let her speak publicly. She needed a distraction. A decoy. Someone with just enough truth to stir the pot, but not enough to destroy the foundation. That's why she reached out to you. Not because she trusted you, but because she knew they wouldn't. The betrayal hit like a slap. Lena had never meant to reunite, never wanted Grace's help out of loyalty. She had used her, positioned her as bait to draw out everyone hiding in the shadows. The entire reunion, the warning messages, the photo, all of it was part of a larger game. You're lying, Grace said, voice trembling. I wish I was, Elias said. But you've already seen it yourself. Gabriel, Mallory, Lena, they're not who you think. Mallory didn't betray you to protect Lena. She did it because she works for Lena. Gabriel didn't reappear to keep you safe. He was sent to make sure you stayed on the wrong path long enough to let the real plan unfold. Grace stood, her chair scraping across the floor. So, what happens now? Elias closed the laptop. Now, you have two choices. Walk out that door and pretend you never saw any of this, or stay and help me expose all of it, including Lena. The ultimatum was brutal. Help the man who built the system that destroyed lives, or go after the sister who used her like a pawn. Neither option felt like justice. But walking away meant silence. And silence had a body count. The door creaked open behind her. Mallory stepped in. Her expression was unreadable, but the gun in her hand wasn't. Sorry, Grace, she said softly. You weren't supposed to see this. Grace's world tilted again. The trap hadn't been in room 214. It had been everyone she trusted. And now, with a gun pointed at her and two powerful players vying for control of the truth, the real question wasn't what happens next. It was, who makes it out of this room alive? And the answer was coming faster than anyone was ready for. Grace didn't move. The sound of her heartbeat roared in her ears louder than the hum of the air conditioning or the slow, deliberate click as Mallory engaged the safety on her weapon and took another step forward. The surrealness of it all nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. Mallory, the one person who had pulled her back from the edge a dozen times, now standing across the room holding the gun with both hands like she'd done it before. Like this wasn't her first time choosing sides. Grace's mind fought to catch up, but the room was spinning, and so was the reality she thought she understood. Elias stood calmly behind the desk like a judge watching a sentence unfold, not blinking, not intervening, almost as if he had been expecting this exact moment to happen, as if it had always been a part of the plan. And maybe it had. I need you to listen to me, Grace said, her voice tight but clear. Mallory, you don't have to do this. Whatever they told you, whatever they promised, it's not worth this. But Mallory's eyes, usually so quick to show emotion, remained cold and focused. You're still thinking like this is about you. Like all of this started because of a file or a conversation or something your sister whispered in the dark. But this was never about just you, Grace. This goes way deeper, way wider. You were just the first one to look at it from the outside. And that made you dangerous. Grace tried to take a step sideways, subtly inching toward the lamp on the table, the only thing within arm's reach that might buy her seconds. So what? You're going to kill me now? Cover it up, move on, pretend none of it ever happened? Mallory hesitated just long enough for Grace to notice it. A flicker of something, regret, maybe, or doubt. But it was there. And then Elias spoke again, his voice cold and methodical, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized years ago. She's not here to kill you, Grace. She's here to protect the program. And if you care about anyone outside this room, you'll stop trying to derail it. Grace snapped toward him, rage bubbling up fast. You mean the program that watches people through their devices? The one that manipulates elections, creates fake scandals, and drives division like it's just another marketing campaign. Elias smiled, but there was no joy in it. We don't create division. We just understand how it works. And yes, we influence behavior, because if we don't, someone else will. You think you're doing good by exposing this? You're not stopping corruption. You're creating chaos. Grace's voice cracked. Then so be it. But Elias was already turning the laptop back toward her, pulling up a new window, a data dashboard. Names, locations, flag communications. It wasn't just a few insiders. It wasn't just the company. Politicians, media anchors, tech giants, even members of supposed watchdog groups. It was all connected. Everyone was part of it, knowingly or unknowingly feeding the system. The predictive surveillance tool wasn't just used to influence outcomes, it was used to engineer them. And then he opened a folder labeled Failsafe Protocols. There were 7 names. Grace's was one. So was Gabriel's, Mallory's, and Lena's. Grace blinked, horrified. What is this? Elias finally looked tired. It's the part you were never supposed to see. If anyone on this list goes off script, the system activates a response. Discreditation, public scandal, financial ruin, or, if necessary, removal. You were supposed to disappear quietly. But Lena changed that. She leaked just enough information to activate you, because she knew you'd go looking. And when you did, every eye turned your way. Grace's stomach dropped. You're making me the villain. No, Mallory said softly. We're making you the lesson. Something in Grace snapped. She lunged for the lamp, grabbed it by the base, and swung it in one motion, glass shattering as it connected with the side of Elias's laptop and sent sparks flying. Mallory shouted, stumbled back. The gun discharged, loud and sharp, and everything went white for a second. Grace dove behind the chair, adrenaline flooding her system, ears ringing. The laptop was in pieces. The data, maybe not gone but exposed. And in that chaos, she saw something else, a second screen behind the desk, already blinking with an outgoing transmission. It wasn't going to stop here. The information was being uploaded. Every name, every file. And then, to her horror, Grace saw something else. Her father's name. Her old professors. Even the journalist who helped her run years ago. They weren't just targets. They were part of it. People she had admired, trusted, built her principles around, they were all compromised. Maybe they had been from the beginning. Maybe that was why she had been watched all along. Grace stood, slowly, breath shaking, blood roaring in her ears. Mallory had backed off now, the gun lowered slightly, but not gone. Elias was still conscious, bleeding from a cut above his temple, but smiling despite the pain. The kind of smile that comes from knowing the damage is already done. You can't stop what's coming, he said. But Grace wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the screen, at the data still streaming out, and then at the emergency fire alarm lever on the wall. If she couldn't shut it down digitally, maybe she could burn the whole thing down. Metaphorically or literally, she hadn't decided yet. Because what she knew now, what had become brutally, painfully clear, was that this wasn't just a conspiracy. It was a machine, and she had been wired into it from the very beginning. Now, the only question left was whether she had enough time to break free, or whether it would destroy her first. The moment the alarm shrieked to life, the sterile calm of the hotel floor transformed into something primal and unhinged. Sirens blared, sprinklers hissed to life, and within seconds the walls felt like they were closing in. Smoke, or maybe just steam, began to cloud the air, but none of it could drown out the chaos in Grace's mind. Her hand still trembled from yanking the emergency lever, knuckles white, breath heaving. Mallory cursed under her breath, trying to shove her phone into her coat while scanning the room, panicked but still clutching the gun. Elias, still bleeding and dazed, was trying to crawl toward what was left of the data terminal. But Grace wasn't watching either of them anymore, because the screen that should have gone dark in the scramble was still flashing with one final message. Failsafe bypass engaged. Subject 03 live stream initiated. The blinking red light above the desk cam confirmed it. Everything was now being broadcast in real time to a private server, and there was no telling who was watching. The entire truth, the surveillance program, the list of names, the manipulation of global events, was no longer a hidden secret locked away in corporate archives. It was now in the wild, and the people behind the curtain were scrambling. For a second, Grace felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this would finally expose them all. But then the twist came like a slap to the face. Another screen lit up across the room, this one showing live security footage from the hotel entrance. A black SUV. Armed men. No insignias. Not police.
Not FBI.
Private sector. And they were coming up fast. Mallory saw it too. Her face went slack. They weren't supposed to send them. Grace turned on her. Who are they? Mallory swallowed. The real owners. The ones who bankrolled the program before the company even had a name. The kind of people who don't care about laws or borders. This isn't just surveillance, Grace. It's control. Control of narratives, of stock markets, of public opinion, of people. Elias laughed behind them, bitter and low. And you thought this would end with me. You never understood the scale. I was a tool. We all were. It was in that moment that Grace saw him for what he really was, not the architect of the system, but another pawn. Maybe one who helped build the frame, sure, but still dispensable. That meant the real enemy, the one pulling the strings, wasn't even in the room. And yet everything now depended on what she did next. The hallway outside was filling with footsteps, heavy and fast. Grace knew she had maybe seconds left. Her instincts screamed to run, to get out while she still could. But her eyes locked on the final terminal, still intact beside the ruined laptop. There was one last option. Transmit the raw files to a dead-drop server, one she had stashed years ago under an old identity, something even she had almost forgotten. It was secure, disconnected, built specifically in case she ever needed to disappear and take the truth with her. But uploading everything would take time she didn't have, and staying meant facing whoever came through that door.
Still, she sat down.
Hands flying across the keys, fingers remembering code she hadn't used since before her life fell apart. The screen stuttered, hesitated, then finally began to upload. Every classified name, every manipulated vote, every shredded life swept under the rug. She didn't know what would happen if it all went public. Maybe panic, maybe revolution, but she knew one thing. Silence had gotten them this far. And she wasn't going to be quiet anymore. Then the door burst open. Black suits. Tactical gear. No words, just action. Two stormed toward Mallory, pinning her to the ground. One aimed straight at Elias, knocking him unconscious with a swift jab of a stun baton. And then the last one turned to Grace.
He paused.
Helmet on, visor down. And then he slowly lifted it. It wasn't Gabriel. It was her father.
Alive.
Not just alive, but in uniform. Military-grade clearance tag dangling from his collar, eyes locked on hers with a strange mix of shame and steel. Grace. You weren't supposed to be here. Her voice was barely a whisper. You died in a car accident. That was the story they gave you. I didn't have a choice. Her entire body shook. So you've been part of this? This whole time? He looked at the uploading screen. You have no idea what you're playing with. If that goes live, Grace, it won't be some noble takedown of corruption. It'll be war. Civil unrest. Collapse. She stood slowly, breath hitching. Then you shouldn't have built something worth collapsing. They stood there, father and daughter, on opposite ends of a wire ready to snap. Then, to her shock, he stepped aside. If you're going to finish this, he said, you better be ready for what comes after. Grace's finger hovered over the final command, and she pressed it. A single keystroke. The upload completed. The room went black. Seconds later, explosions rocked the building, not from bombs, but from the data itself, released across every major platform by the failsafe. News agencies, activist groups, encrypted forums. It was everywhere now. But the twist wasn't over. As she and the others were escorted down the emergency stairwell, surrounded by shadowy guards who had suddenly gone silent, Grace's father leaned in and whispered something she wasn't ready for. There's another layer. What you uploaded was just the surface. The real program is still active. And now they know who you are. The game hadn't ended. It had just gone public. And Grace? She wasn't running anymore. She was going to fight. But this time, the whole world would be watching. The weeks that followed were a blur of headlines, protests, emergency press conferences, and televised denials that only made the truth hit harder. Grace watched it unfold from a secure compound hidden in the forests of upstate New York, a location arranged by the few whistleblowers still loyal to the idea of transparency. She didn't want to be a symbol, but somehow that's exactly what she had become. Her face leaked in edited clips across TikTok and YouTube Shorts, turned into hashtags like #GraceExposed and #Surveillanceleaks. Conspiracy channels tried to twist her into a villain, others branded her a hero, but Grace didn't care anymore about how she was labeled. What mattered was that the silence had finally been broken. The truth, messy, terrifying, incomplete, was finally in the public domain. And that had been the one thing they'd never prepared for. The files she uploaded, while massive in scope, didn't destroy the system. Not even close. But it did something arguably more powerful. It forced it to evolve under scrutiny. The corporations involved were dragged into courtrooms and congressional hearings, live-streamed for millions under viral titles like Big Tech Under Fire and Government Spying on You. The irony of it all was painful. The very platforms that had enabled the system were now being used to challenge it. Leaks turned into investigations. Hidden partnerships were exposed. But for every thread pulled, 10 more seemed to appear, tangled beneath decades of bureaucratic camouflage. Still, something had shifted. The illusion had been pierced. Elias was arrested, but never officially charged. Rumors swirled that he'd traded immunity for silence, or that he had simply vanished in a private exchange no one dared document. Mallory, on the other hand, flipped completely. Whether it was guilt, survival instinct, or some twisted sense of justice, she testified against nearly every major player, revealing the internal protocols and coded language used to control public discourse. She and Grace shared one final conversation in a cold, fluorescent-lit room, where apologies passed between them like smoke. Nothing solid, but still real. Mallory would disappear into witness protection. Grace didn't ask where. As for her father, he was never seen again. No one could confirm whether he was alive or dead. Grace received only one item after he vanished, a weathered envelope mailed without a return address. Inside was a flash drive, encrypted with a key only she could recognize, an old puzzle she used to solve with him when she was 8 years old. The files on the drive weren't like the others. These were darker, even more disturbing. Programs not just designed to monitor, but to predict dissent, emotionally manipulate social groups, and even simulate public outrage. Projects labeled with names like Echoloop and the Fracture Model. It was proof that the system wasn't just defensive, it was predatory. It didn't just react to conflict. It manufactured it. Grace never released those files. Not yet. She knew that information of that magnitude, if dumped all at once, could implode the fragile equilibrium already cracking beneath the surface. She made a choice, the kind of choice her father had once begged her to consider, the kind with no good outcome, only consequences. Instead of leaking them, she created something new. A decentralized platform, open source, encrypted, and resistant to corporate acquisition. A place for others like her to come forward, to connect the dots themselves. To learn the truth, but at their own pace, on their own terms. She didn't give the world a revolution. She gave them a map. The final twist, however, came not from what she discovered, but what she didn't. One night, months later, long after the noise had quieted and her name had faded from trending searches, Grace received a private message on her new network. No sender. No traceable path. Just one line of text. This was never about the program. It was about you. Attached was an image. A grainy scan of an old research paper written before she was even born. Its subject? Behavioral predictability in genetically linked cognitive patterns. The authors were listed as part of a now-defunct government think tank. The final page was signed by someone using her father's real name, decades ago. The implication hit her like a punch to the chest. What if she wasn't just a threat to the system because of what she found, but because of what she was? What if her whole life had been watched, guided, not just out of fear, but expectation? Was her rebellion an anomaly or an outcome? She stared at the message for hours that night, unable to close her laptop, unable to sleep. And when the sun rose, for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel peace. She felt watched. But she also felt ready. Because now she knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the prologue to something much, much bigger. And whatever came next, she would meet it head on.